In the 1600s, a man handed one of the most celebrated scholars in Europe a strip of silk covered in mysterious symbols and asked him what they meant. The scholar was a Jesuit named Athanasius Kircher, and he set to work by immediately running the symbols through everything he knew about the ancient languages of the world. Maybe he ran through the possible meanings just in his mind, or maybe Kircher used what he called his steganographic arc, a strange combinatory device the Emperor Ferdinand III apparently praised for its ability to reduce all languages down to one. All languages down to one? Well, that's just one level of the BS that came out of the work of Father Kircher. For as the story goes, Kircher spent days on this strip of paper and its strange symbols. Then one day by chance, he caught the symbols in a mirror and saw the truth. He hadn't been handed an ancient or mysterious script at all. It was symbols in the ordinary Latin alphabet, printed backwards, and the message, when read properly, took a stab at teaching old Father Kircher a lesson. When you translate this Latin to English, the message reads, "Do not seek vain things or waste time on unprofitable trifles." But waste time is exactly what Kircher did, and Kircher never seems to have learned his lesson. But his story teaches those of us who love to learn, especially as self-directed learners, a tremendously valuable lesson. Now, part of that lesson has to do with eliminating the illusion of knowing more than you actually do. And another part of it has to do with eliminating or at least reducing a psychological problem called confabulation. So today we're going to learn how to avoid both of those problems, something increasingly mission critical in a world where our information robots are a little bit like Father Kircher for reasons that we'll see. You know, he was revered by some people as a master of everything there was to know in the universe, but other people exposed his flaws with very, very good ease, as we've seen with this Latin mirror writing example. But he was kind of like an early GPT robot, just pumping out endless stuff at a moment's notice. And he wrote thousands and thousands of pages of absolute rubbish. And he had the illusion of learning. So what is the illusion of learning, or what is sometimes called the illusion of competence? It's essentially a cognitive bias where you mistake the way you interact with information for actually mastering it. Now, there's no shame in falling into its trap. It's happened to all of us. For example, I've gone on tour with musicians far better than I am who really know their stuff. And because I can memorize a lot of fancy information about music, sometimes it creates the illusion that I know more about music than I actually do. If I have one saving grace, it's that I can maybe write music a little bit better than Father Kircher. He claimed to know everything there was to know about composition, wrote about it, and someone on Bandcamp who goes by the name of Gavin Gamboa seems to have brought some of Kircher's compositions to life. And there isn't much information about this recording, and your mileage may vary, but I found it to be some of the most horrible music I've ever heard. And judging by what I've read of Kircher's descriptions of music, he really doesn't know that much about it. And then there's the episode with the cat piano, which Kircher may have been involved in creating, and I'm sure that sounded horrible too, on top of being incredibly cruel. In any case, we're going to talk about some ways to avoid the illusion of learning in a bit, but let's deal with confabulation next. In many ways, confabulation is worse than the illusion of learning, and unfortunately, I've suffered it myself and have rushed to correct one major mistake when I discovered something that, it's forgivable in one sense, but Kircher, he never seems to have corrected the record when he was caught out, certainly not in a way that I have found compelling. So what is confabulation? Well, it's a little bit complex. It's when your brain invents something that's not true, but it does so in a way that feels true to you, and it feels 100% correct, and you have no intention to deceive anybody. Your brain provides no warning label that says, "Beware, cowboy, I just made this up, it ain't true," but you just really think that it is. And you're not lying. Lying is when you know the truth, but you don't speak it. And worse, lying often involves hiding the truth. But when confabulation takes place in your memory, you don't even realize there's a gap between fiction and reality. And that's what makes it so dangerous. And so I think there are cases where Kircher was not sitting down to deceive anybody. He certainly did deceive people intentionally, but he was very famous in his time. He received so many letters from rich and important people around the world, including books they sent him, various inventions and devices. And I have no doubt that in some of his many books where he repeated various pieces of information from people, he probably not only thought that the information was accurate, but probably memories formed in his mind where he was not trying to deceive anyone. And Kircher, we can also be sympathetic to, especially in our time with the internet, because his project was to know everything there was to know. Well, isn't that what we're doing in our time with the internet? Problem for us is that we got to do better than Kircher, because there are a lot of people seeing messages pumped out by robots and spending days and days and days pondering them, not really realizing that things are not exactly what they seem. Now, Kircher getting fooled with backwards Latin is one thing, but there was another guy named Andreas Muller who made up an entire language, wrote a document, asked Kircher for a translation, and apparently Kircher sent him back one at lightning speed. So he was like a Renaissance chatbot, writing thousands of pages of BS, and many people during Kircher's time gobbled it down without question. But as lifelong learners, especially if you want to be taken seriously in your profession, you can't afford to produce BS. And this is something I'm more and more aware of as I face the paradox of going to a law school that forbids the use of AI for working on assignments and yet has an AI in its email program. It has a searchable library. And, we all have to use search engines to find acts and cases in law school. Even the teachers show us YouTube videos during seminars. And how do we know whether those people used some sort of script or not from a bot? And the reality is that copying from bots or using bot material is not even new to bots. People have rewritten each other for decades, centuries, and Kircher did that too. More and more, we as self-directed learners and people who want to be top achievers are going to have to show proof of work that can be used in the public sphere and increasingly pass higher and higher levels of scrutiny. So where I'm coming from is as a battle-worn PhD with 2 MAs, and I'm now working towards a second BA in the law, and I've got 15 years of creating content that has been scraped by bots galore. So I'm going to show you today and share with you how not to be like Athanasius Kircher. And if withstanding scrutiny as you develop a stronger memory is the kind of skill that you want as a self-taught learner, a polymath, an autodidact, this is Dr. Anthony Metivier inviting you to get subscribed if you're new here. And for the love of memory, smash that like button as if you were trying to pound some sense into Father Kircher's head. And let's get into what really is going to help distinguish you as a learner. Now, some of what I'm going to suggest to you is going to take a little bit of extra time, but it's going to distinguish you from other people at the end of the day. Okay, so the first thing I would suggest that you do is avoid imposing a grand theory onto the various pieces of information that you collect in your research. Kircher read all kinds of Neoplatonic ideas into Egyptian hieroglyphs, for example. And although Daniel Stolzenberg defends Kircher to a certain extent in this book, Egyptian Oedipus, it's not really convincing to me, the way that Stolzenberg tries to convince us that Kircher was actually acting like other scholars of his time and trying to demonstrate erudition within accepted study conventions. That's not much of an excuse. Even though I don't say Stolzenberg is wrong about that observation, there were other scholars who existed both before and during Kircher's life who tried to do better and did do better. And Descartes, for example, was one of them. Even Giordano Bruno, as controversial as he has been, was more scientific in his approach than Kircher. And, the philosopher Leibniz originally praised Kircher, but he later realized his error and ate his own words and set the record straight. And then he didn't say very nice things about Kircher at all. Now, I know a little bit of what it's like to be seduced by a grand theory. If you've ever read my book, The Victorious Mind, I talk about how I tried to skirt out of that when it came to various effects that were created by memory-based meditation. And also, when Tyson Yunkaporta was on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast, he told me, he said, you might be the guy who comes up with the grand unifying theory of memory. And I said, no. I don't want to have any such thing like that, because of how dangerous it is. Not only dangerous for your own ego, but also it just doesn't help other people. We need to be more modest and humble and avoiding grand theories, even if you have weird mystical experiences. If you read The Victorious Mind at the end, you'll know that I basically just say, yes, I've had these experiences, but just the guru stuff, no thank you. And there's a very, very important message there about avoiding that kind of quote-unquote spiritual sickness, as the guru, I guess, James Schwartz calls it. But he's a very good guru indeed, because he says, yes, there's this grand theory, but the real teacher is the teacher who tries to help you and then get rid of you and have you not think of him as a teacher anymore. So grand unifying theories, be gone. To avoid being a crank, you can also make sure that you check your sources rigorously, robustly. And that's something that's getting harder and harder to do. Things just disappear from the internet. And it is very, very important that you get stronger about writing down your citations, because unchecked internet citations can lead to disaster. It's so critical that when you learn something, you write down where it came from, when you found it, and then keep those notes in physical space. And you want to back them up digitally, that's fine, but get your little index cards out and photograph them, but make sure that you have backups in the physical analog world as well as the digital. Now, you might be thinking this is going to take a lot of time, and yes, it will, but it also will encode an extra layer of memory, and it can be quite efficient just using simple index cards. And when I use index cards, it's just very, very easy to write down the page number of where I found a piece of information, or somehow indicate where it came from, the name of the website, and have a number of cards gathered together in a place where I can find them. And if I am going to use bots, one of the best things that I ever found to do was say, explain this with a citation from a verifiable human and authoritative source, right? And even ask it to explain why it used that source, which can be very insightful. This one habit will make a lot of problems easier to fix. First of all, the illusion of competence is something that you will mitigate, because you're actually asking for the bots to share whatever it is that they're doing in their own illusion of competence, and you're creating some kind of genealogy of where things are coming from, and then you're capturing it when you look up those resources. By keeping index cards, for example, you'll also make confabulation easier to fix if you ever realize, wait a second, I don't know if that's true, and I found out that it isn't. The one major time it happened to me involved misinterpreting something from David Eagleman, author of The Brain and many other really interesting books. And basically, I went around verbally misquoting Eagleman probably for a couple of years by saying that the brain can contain a zettabyte of information. And then one day I wanted to cite this, and I went back into a book that I'd read, and I couldn't find it. And then I found something similar on the internet, and then I realized, wait a second, I memorized this wrong. What I'd actually read was, in order to capture all the data from a human brain would require a zettabyte of capacity. A zettabyte is essentially the computational capacity of our entire planet right now. So, although that's not wildly different from what I was saying, it's not exactly the right way I was quoting him. So I immediately called myself out on my podcast, and also during one of my live Magnetic Memory Method boot camps, amongst a few other places, to correct the record. Now, it would have been better to never have made such a mistake at all, believe me. But the probable reason why my brain confabulated this information in the first place is because when I read The Brain, I didn't write out the full quote on a card, nor the page number. And so I only memorized the word zettabyte because it was so unusual. I'd never come across it before. And my brain wound up weaving what Eagleman said, not only from this book, from an article, maybe I heard it in an interview, and it just became something quite different. And I was convinced that what I was saying was true. So my saving grace was that I did my best to correct the record and update what I've been saying. But Kircher, I don't think he ever agreed or took a comeuppance or tried to correct records. And he was aware of the rigorous philological analysis that had been used by Isaac Casaubon to demonstrate that the Hermetica, which is a supposedly ancient Egyptian text that formed the bedrock of Kircher's worldview. Kircher found out that these were actually post-Christian fabrications. They had nothing to do with ancient Egypt at all, except for perhaps some Christians being influenced by ancient Egypt. And for some reason I cannot fathom, Kircher just ignored Casaubon's definitive debunking. And it gets even weirder because Stolzenberg acknowledges this, but he still defends Kircher, despite the fact that the foundational premise of Kircher's life's work was fraudulent even before it was ever published. And Stolzenberg seems to think we owe Kircher some slack for the reasons that other people during his time were doing it too, and because Kircher was effectively a creative force. Well, I don't deny for a second that Kircher was a creative force, but Margaret Cavendish was also a creative force, and she still took pains to make it clear that her book, The Blazing World, was philosophical fiction. So on top of avoiding grand theories, on top of making sure you check your references, that you record your references, and that you don't make stuff up, another problem to avoid is isolation. So many people these days operate entirely within private, digital silos. They're utterly disconnected from established scientific methods, historical consensus, and baseline physical realities, let alone people that they're talking to regularly, ideally people who have some authority in various areas who can point you in the right direction, and people who can just have a regular old-fashioned debate with you. It doesn't have to be right or wrong all the time, but that you're at least accountable to other people, not just consulting bots all the time. This is one of the many reasons why when I took my real estate license, I chose the actual classroom in an actual physical space instead of what I could have done, which is an online version. And that was just not acceptable. I wanted to be with people, talk with the teacher, get that expertise in granular detail through a dialectic method of dialogue back and forth. Now, for law school, I can't do that. I have to study remotely online, but at least it's real online teachers. You can talk with them back and forth, and at least it's a credentialed university program and not just me studying law on my own without someone checking my knowledge as I progress through quizzes and assignments and presentations that I have to give. I have to memorize and deliver. And that's, another one of Kircher's errors. He was cloistered, literally cloistered in the sense of being a Jesuit, and well, he did have all these correspondences from people all around the world. But how many people he actually met, how many places he actually went to? Some of his critics said when he was writing books about China and so forth, dude, have you ever actually been there? Because some of the stuff he says about China is just downright wild. Now, another problem that Kircher had is that he let spectacle substitute for substance. This is a problem that I see and criticize all the time in the memory improvement world. So I have a memory training program and I base it on what I can actually do for long-term retention. But there are a lot of people who have memory improvement programs and they're memory competitors, and they don't actually retain things for a long time. The spectacle of memorizing a deck of cards and then retaining it for 5 to 10 minutes or however long it takes to demonstrate on the day that you've retained it. Well, that's one thing, but that's not the same thing as actually being able to retain massive amounts of information. And so that's spectacle over substance. And Kircher was all about spectacle. He believed in magnetism as a force, and He may have been onto something in some ways that have proven true, but he wasn't truthful about it. He used the tactics of a stage magician to dazzle people with demonstrations. And he caught the attention of everyone from royalty to serious philosophers. But those who tried to reproduce Kircher's sunflower clock were unsuccessful because it was BS. He made it up. He used subterfuge and legerdemain. And although the illustrations in his books are wonderful, of course, but as cool as the art in Kircher's books is, none of that excuses his big claims and the fact that he got dozens of very serious matters wrong. From his translations of the Egyptian hieroglyphs to his ideas about how the plague came from some kind of little tiny worm, he had so many theories just coming out of nowhere with no basis. But I think there is one thing that we can take from Kircher and use as a mental model to great effect. And that's the matter of thinking in terms of scale. Now, Kircher had this idea that the plague came from worms and spontaneous generation, and he may have got that completely wrong. But he at least tried to see at a very, very small scale. And at extraordinary risk, if it's true, the idea that he put the blood of a plague victim under a microscope, and he saw what he thought were little worms. Well, there's no doubt in my mind that he was groping towards a theory of contagion. And, he was at best looking at blood cells, not bacteria. But he was zooming down as far as possible as he could for a cause to explain the plague. And he didn't stop at the microscopic. He also tried to examine the moon and the sun, and he thought deeply about what was under the earth. And if memory serves, he also thought there were moons in the center of the earth. Look, these conclusions may have been junk, but thinking at scale and trying to find relationships between the massive heavenly bodies and what we see down here on earth, scale is a mental model we could all use more of. Maybe not in the way Kircher did it, but we can learn from that. The massive intelligence that we as humans have compared to AI, for example. Well, we can use scale to think about that. And we can think about the context of intelligence in many, many different ways. What is the smallest unit of a thought that your mind contains? What's the biggest unit of thought? And where exactly do both reside? Where do the thoughts about other thoughts exist? Are they somewhere outside of you? Or is your awareness of the fact that other thoughts are stored in brains, in computers, in hard drives, etc., is that somehow all contained within you? Now, that's not to get woo-woo or philosophical, but it is an interesting idea, and it allows you to have a sense of scale. Anything you're learning right now, be it anatomy, a language, scripture, legal doctrine, or a piece of music, you can use the mental model of scale to help you situate the information in ways that can help you learn it better through comparison. And if you find out that you're wrong about something, thinking in terms of scale can help you put your ego aside and see yourself in the grand sweep of history as being pretty much insignificant in a way that's positive. And you find out how much better it feels when you study slow, verify your sources as best you can, and enter into the world as little BS as possible. Remember, people, and now robots, form judgments within milliseconds, nanoseconds. And those judgments, they tend to stick in human memory pretty good, but they stick in computer memory far better. And it's just the best policy to get everything that you produce as accurate as possible, because although corrections are good, corrections almost never travel as far as the original mistake. And if you want help keeping your ego on a leash as a lifelong learner and ways to avoid mistakes as part of your daily study practice so that what enters your memory has a higher rate of success, I've put together a free resource called the Self-Education Blueprint. It's the exact framework I use when I use it properly to turn scattered learning into durable, verifiable expertise. The documentation habits, the encoding methods, the ways to build knowledge that you can stand behind. The link is in the description. And before you go, here's another tool that might sting, but one that I've found incredibly valuable the few times I've needed to use it. Keep a list of the things you've gotten wrong. I'm talking about a physical, dated page in a journal where you record any time you discover that you were wrong about something. And beside it, list any place where you made the error and the source where you found the correct information. And rather than treat being wrong as humiliation that you need to bury or ignore the way Kircher did, collect your errors with purpose and use the corrections to do the best that you can. And soon I think you'll find that your ego stops running the show and being wrong becomes useful data instead of a stinging wound. And this kind of activity works very, very well, and you don't have to take my word for it. One of the most accomplished learners in history already showed us how well it works. His name was Benjamin Franklin. He was a printer and many, many other things. And in his famous autobiography, he used a word from the world of printing to describe his personal failings. This word was errata, and it's normally used to list the kind of errors you fix between one edition of a book and the next. Call your error journaling what you like. The point is that Benjamin Franklin not only named his errors, he set out to correct them. I believe this simple habit helped Franklin achieve more in ways that you can too, all while staying grounded and modest the same way he did, illusion-free and as safe from confabulation as it's possible to get. To learn more about Franklin, watch my video on the secret learning habits that made Benjamin Franklin both humble and rich. Next, I did my best to make it a masterclass on the practical, down-to-earth opposite of the many things Kircher did, and it'll show you how Franklin actually worked to learn and remember what really matters in this life. So go ahead, watch that next, get my self-education blueprint, and until we have a chance to speak again, come visit me at the Magnetic Memory Method headquarters on the internet and join one of my upcoming live memory training boot camps. And as I always like to say, keep yourself magnetic.